So from this moment, we're recording. Thank you very much indeed for everyone attending today for today's presentation. My name is Steve Bennett. I'm the Director of Safety Delivery. Managing Safety Compliance is the overarching title of the compliance courses that I provide to clients. Today's Managing Safety Compliance is specifically looking at reopening safely after lockdown and building for the future, particularly looking at the future. So welcome to today's presentation. And I'm going to look at understanding legal responsibilities in health and safety to achieve compliance. I'm going to look at methodology and the risk assessment approach. And having sort of looked at that umbrella, I will then go into the COVID-19 safety legal requirements, and we'll look at all the advice surrounding that. And then we'll consider the key safety issues that are facing business and organisations during the pandemic, and looking forward, how do we achieve compliance once roadmap is completed, because health and safety doesn't end there, really, it begins at that point in many other ways. So safety law compliance is, we're chiefly looking at, we're going to be looking at how we achieve that both in the short and especially the long term. The law, so what does it mean? Some of you will be familiar with this, the Health and Safety at Work Act. It is sort of an overarching act. It's what's known as an enabling act, and I'll come to that in a minute. It's the duty of every employer to ensure the health, safety and welfare at work of all employees. This is where health and safety law really springs from. And it goes into a little bit more detail that every employer conducting their undertaking must ensure safety of people in their employment. And similarly, they have a responsibility for others. So if you have contractors, the general public, there is that responsibility, that duty of care for employers and organisations. Now, that extends as well to anyone who has control of premises. So if you're renting a premises, you're part of a larger office building, for example, then the Act also covers you, your landlord, other people within that premises. So the duty of care extends sort of beyond your own scope in that respect as well. Incidentally, I'm going to be whizzing through a few slides with lots of small writing. Don't worry about reading that. Hopefully you'll be engaged in listening to me, and obviously you'll be getting all of these slides afterwards, as well as having a recording. Participants or anyone who emails me will have access to the slides as well, so you can read all of this at your leisure. But this is simply to indicate what is covered in Health and Safety at Work Act and other legislation that I'll be looking at. So we have to consider anyone in tenancy, so I've covered that as well, in terms of maintenance of premises. Anyone who has any sort of control over a premises, they have an extension of that obligation to them. So this also relates to contractors going on site as well as somebody renting part of a premises. So it's quite wide ranging. Now, what do I mean by enabling act? Well, here's some examples of other enabling acts. So if anyone is thinking of manslaughter or corporate homicide, you're covered there as well. And under the 2007 Act, various other acts. There's one at the bottom there, Coroners and Justice Act. I'll mention that a little bit later. But basically what it means is that an act is the instrument whereby prosecution will take place. So if you breach an element of an act, such as an Health and Safety at Work Act, then somebody like the Health and Safety Executive will come along and they will prosecute you under a section of the Act. Now, there are loads of regulations. So what's the difference? These are known as statutory instruments, and you can see loads here, and this is just in the health and safety sector. But basically what happens is that if you break a regulation, then you will be prosecuted, but you will be prosecuted under the Act. So that's the Enabling Act. So HSE, as an example, will come along. If you've breached the management of health and safety at work regs, then they will prosecute you, but it will be under the Health and Safety at Work Act for the breach of the regulation. So I hope everyone quite understands that mechanic of how things work. And of course, the Health and Safety Executive, not the only ones who conduct prosecutions, particularly in the health and safety sector, where local authorities are also quite active, particularly in the food sector. So they have specific powers as well. So it doesn't have to be the HSE, but the prosecution, remember, is under the Enabling Act, whichever that might be. What did Brexit do to all of this? Answer, not very much. It's been a number of years. We're finally out. But in fact, health and safety regulations were carried over from all the previous regulatory apparatus. So we can see here that going back to 2018, there was a draft proposals published. In fact, it became bill and law that pretty well most of the health and safety regulations in force in the UK were transferred over, and we can see here the statutory instrument that was used for that, exiting the European Union. So that was all done. So far, Brexit has not had that effect on health and safety regulation for this reason. I'm not saying that things won't change, but this is where we stand at present. I'm going to look at a couple of the regulations now. Managing Health and Safety Regs 1999, Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Orders, so that's the fire regulations. You're probably thinking at this stage, hang on, I signed up to learn all about the roadmap and what do we do, and go back on April the 12th. I hope that you can sort of perceive this as an overview at this stage, because I'm hoping to impress upon you the need for going beyond the roadmap and what will be required afterwards. We may all throw our hats up in the air on June the 21st and say it's all over, but in fact it won't be. So I hope that this gives a good idea of where we're going from there. So let's just have a quick look at this particular one, the Managing Health and Safety at Work regs. Establish the principle of risk assessment. Now, we'll all be very familiar with that, far more perhaps than we were before COVID, because it's a requirement to have COVID risk assessment in the workplace. And this all stems from these regulations from 1999. So we need to be very well aware of this. If you are an employer, you do have to have risk assessments. They have to be in writing if it's 5 or more people, but it's always a very, very good idea to have things in writing anyway, especially in this day and age and in the era of COVID. So there we are. And of course, if you need to review, you must do. Normally, you might have a sort of risk assessment once a year. Depending on your situation, your environment, it could well be more often than that. And where things change, you must make sure that you review, because you have to have risk assessments that are called suitable and sufficient. And that's not me coming up with some grand phrase. It is, in fact, a phrase that's used in legal terms, so that if you fail to provide a risk assessment that is not considered suitable and sufficient, a judge would come along and say, exactly that, not suitable and sufficient, and therefore you could face fines and penalties. This is just underlying the fact that written records do need to be kept. We would certainly advise, even if you have less than 5 employees, do keep written records, because if you're asked any questions by HSE or anybody, at least you've got something in writing. It's about demonstrating that you have taken measures. And of course, make sure that if you do have risk assessment, that it's by a competent person. So it ties in with the fact that have to be suitable and sufficient. Competent person needs to be someone who has sufficient training or experience of knowledge of the environment in which you work as well. So there are a number of qualities required from the competent person, which again is a legal term. If your risk assessment is not considered suitable and sufficient, the judge will also look at the competency of the person who drew up whatever you might have. So again, that's a criterion that is applied in legal terms. And information to employees. It's mandatory. It's no good having these things, writing them up. They might be superb. It might be the best risk assessment in the world. But if you stick it in a drawer, don't show it to anybody, then it's of no use whatsoever. And again, it could come back that you haven't provided the information which is mandatory under the regulations. Remembering, of course, that health and safety is all about preventing and protection rather than waiting for after the event. If you don't sort of apply the regulations and fall foul of the law, then there are penalties out there. Most recently, we had something called the sentencing guidelines 5 years ago now. But it applies, as we can see, to health and safety offences. It's since been extended to fire safety offences as well. At the time, described as the most dramatic change in health and safety enforcement since 1974, the Health and Safety at Work Act. Basically, this provided a matrix for fines and penalties, so that the more turnover a company might have, the greater the fine, and a judge could just look at the chart and apply fines according to the matrix, taking into account mitigation, of course. And we have seen some very heavy fines, more than £1 million for some of the larger employers since then. And another thing to bear in mind is that the sentencing guidelines, which is actually in itself sort of a regulation, and it comes under the Justice Coroners Act, which I mentioned earlier. So that will be the enabling act. But the sentencing guidelines are applied in law. And one of the key changes here as well, that as well as the maximum penalties that were imposed, the culpability being very high, the game changer perhaps is that the guidelines state that health and safety offences are concerned with the failures to manage risks. So the offence is actually in creating a risk of harm. So even if nothing happens, somebody could come along, HSE inspector, they could view bad practice, dangerous practice, hazards, risks, and you may face a penalty that would reflect what might happen, that could have happened, if the issues had not been addressed. So something else to bear in mind. Quickly, I'm going to look at risks. What does that mean? Well, we can see from the picture here where we see lots of hazards and risks going on around us. This is my local housing estate. I like to take pictures of things happening around me, and we can see there some of the issues. Hazards at work. What are they? A hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm to you or others, and the risk is the chance of something happening that has the potential to cause harm. And when we do a risk assessment, we calculate what the likelihood is of that happening. And we obviously see this in our COVID risk assessments. I'm sure a lot of people are now familiar with that, but risk assessment process has been around a long time, and it will still remain in all respects for foreseeable future. Again, no need for the binoculars for anyone who wants to read through this, but number of hazards, that's just a small number there to consider. All sorts of things that we have to think about when we consider hazards. And if we're going to do risk assessments, all of these things need to be taken into account. So when I talk about what's suitable and sufficient, then we have to make sure that our risk assessments are valid and they do address the issues that we need to address. And obviously we need to make sure that it's a competent review and a competent assessment. And we have to consider things, the invisible hazards. We're going to see perhaps a lot more of this, even prior to COVID, stress cases hitting high levels, and I'm sure that we're going to see that increasing over time. So we have to consider what is not only visible to the eye, what is underlying, what are the invisible hazards. The risks, we look at what type of harm may be caused, who is affected, how many people affected, how serious could the harm be, and as I said before, it's the likelihood that provides us with a calculation for our risk assessment. Now, if you want a simple guide to risk assessments, HSE website is great for a lot of things, including that, provides tremendous advice, which is a good thing because HSE's budget has been cut so drastically over the years that you can't really speak to people on a personal level there very easily anymore. But they do provide a good website with plenty of information. The HSE's Guide to Controlling Risks will tell you how to identify hazards, who might be harmed and how, and tell you ways to evaluate the risks arising from those hazards. And then you establish controls, because once we have all of the findings of the risk assessment, we need to put controls in place. And as I said, we have to review these risk assessments very regularly. No point throwing them in the drawer, forgetting them. This is an organic thing. So there we are, the risk assessment standard must be suitable and sufficient. Consider what's reasonable and practicable as well. Another legal term, you're not expected to spend sort of £1 million on putting controls into place if it's not reasonable and practicable. But if something goes wrong, a judge will look at what you did, what control measures did you take? Were they reasonable and practicable? So there's something to bear in mind from a legal point of view as well. Once you're advised of what controls should be put in place, you will prioritise and you will balance your budget, and you will do everything you can to take measures that are reasonable and practicable. And again, just to underline that everything should be carried out by a competent person. So that is quite often somebody engaged as a consultant, an expert. But if you're doing something in-house, and ensure that they also have that required expertise. Communication, I really get into the crux of things now, because it is about communicating what hazards and risks are, what the controls are, and ensuring that everyone not only has knowledge of them, but in fact does abide by them, so that everything is put into practice. It's all covered again under the regulations. Here we are, cooperation, coordination. If you're sharing a workplace, other employers sharing your workspace, then you need to cooperate, coordinate with others. And that does include landlords, it includes other contractors. It is about sharing information, extremely important, again, covered by legislation, and that information must be the relevant information as well. And similarly, if other employers, employees, self-employed coming on to your premises, make sure it's comprehensible, that they do understand it, particularly in this day and age where we have, for instance, a lot of contractors whose first language is not English, still obliged to ensure that they understand health and safety aspects, what's required of them, and also what is being done for them and on their behalf. Training, very important, to make sure that employees understand what their role is, and that they understand all of the implications of health and safety in the workplace. And that should be on recruitment, and when there are any changes at all, where there may be new or increased risks that they face. Quick look at fire safety, because this comes under very similar regime. So all of those sort of regulations and the managing health and safety at work regs really are built into the fire safety order here. Very much the same thing. It replaced the old fire brigade certificate. So it's all risk assessment based. All of those same principles apply. And similarly, any person who has some level of control in a premises has to take reasonable steps. They do have that same duty of care. And again, there is the responsibility involved in exchanging information. So it could be an employer, it could be the owner, landlord, managing agents, any occupier or a tenant, anybody on the site. Again, if anyone with some level of control does have that duty of care and is regarded as a responsible person. There's a list there of the type of people who may be responsible for fire in any type of premises or on site, and pretty well all premises where activities go on are covered by the fire safety order. Bear in mind, this does tie in very much with the managing health and safety at work regs. It's all part of the same animal, really, and we have to consider this in all our thinking in terms of risk assessing. So again, you need to make sure that everyone knows about the risks in fire safety, what measures are in place, ensure that emergency procedures are known and everyone is aware. Now, before I go on to the specific roadmap stroke COVID specific advice, just want to have a look at some of the latest statistics. And again, the reason for this is to underline that health and safety is an issue that's always been around. There are so many major issues that are stark, relevant, and still need to be tackled. This is before COVID and afterwards. Now, these latest figures from the Health and Safety Executive, interestingly, go up to about end of March 2020. So the 2020 figures do relate to 2019 to 20 up to about the end of March, which is a coincidence that obviously COVID from last year has had such a tremendous impact. How this relates to the HSE figures, we will wait and see. But this indicates here what the situation was before. So the annual case cost of new cases to business was £10.6 billion. All of this from the HSE website available. I have been asked, where did the HSE get their figures? They get them from quite reliable sources, for example, the International Labour Organization. So people who have actually invested quite a bit in finding these figures, developing them and putting them out there as actual figures. The annual cost of workplace injury, £5.6 billion. Non-fatal injuries to workers, there were 700,000 non-fatal injuries, 111 fatalities during that time. HSE has been quite busy despite cutbacks in resources. more than 7,000 enforcement notices issued in that year. That has come down actually because of the cutbacks. I think the previous year it was about 10 to 11,000, but nevertheless they are there and they do enforce health and safety. And work-related illnesses. Before COVID came along, 1.6 million per year suffering work-related illness, 500,000 work-related musculoskeletal disorder cases. And the number of work-related cases of stress or depression, the figure of 800,000 for the last year was quite a considerable increase on the previous year, I think by something like 100,000 or more. That's a figure that we're going to see continue to escalate. So this gives us a good idea of what we were facing before the pandemic, what we're going to be facing afterwards as well. And a final interesting figure from HSE here regarding deaths linked to previous exposures to things like chemicals and dusts. We can see 13,000 in that year linked to things like chemicals and dust. 2,500 deaths annually from mesothelioma. This is mainly related to asbestos exposure. And 17,000 new cases annually of breathing or lung problems. So we can sort of imagine what things might be like in the coming year or two. But there you are, it gives an idea of where we stand coming into the pandemic. And I'm going to look now at what we do now, from now on, during the roadmap and well beyond that. I hope that's given you a good background. Looking at the Coronavirus Act 2020, Public Health Control of Disease Act 84. I know I've heard of that one, but I'll come to that. Both of these are being used currently in terms of controlling individual behaviour. These are the tools that are being used to limit gatherings, for example, and to take all other measures, mandatory mask wearing, all that kind of thing, to limit the transmission of COVID-19. So these are the two tools being used. Everyone is familiar with the Coronavirus Act, which the government is utilising, but they're also utilising the much older bit of legislation as a matter of interest. That's always been there, and that's also being utilised to make sure that people are abiding by all the current restrictions, all the current rules surrounding COVID-19 and protection and prevention. The enforcement as well, that is being done under the existing acts. So the Enabling Acts, Health and Safety at Work Act, and via the regulations that I've spoken about. So you may be breaching sort of COVID rules, but quite often, and I am very aware of press reports and the HSE so overstretched that they're not taking cases forward at the moment. But there will come a time when there will be a change in that, when they're not so overwhelmed. We must be aware of sort of the legal apparatus that's available to them and where they will be going in the future. And it will be via things like the Managing Health and Safety Work regs. So we have to bear that in mind. And the breach of duty, of course, is the underlying sort of thing here. Every employer has that duty of care to employees, other employees, contractors, the general public, it's all there. So breaching that duty of care is the trigger that will lead to prosecutions, and it will be mainly under things like the Health and Safety at Work Act. We're all very familiar now with the type of sort of things that are being put forward, the COVID secure form that needs to be displayed in premises, and we're quite familiar with this type of form. Similarly, QR codes for the NHS, test and trace. Not going to go into all the minuscule details of these things for the purposes of today's presentation. I think that type of detail is known to you, but I will be giving you advice on where to go if you need much more detail, things like resources. So, for example, the government information, we can see the chief website there at the top. The notice is available there on that second link, and the QR posts, again, all available online. So we can get much more information from online resources. Working safely during coronavirus. Now, national restrictions, they've come and gone. We've been through a lot of different processes during the past year. Most notably, or most recently notably, I should say, national restrictions were applied from January the 6th, where people were told they must stay at home except for specific purposes. As we know, there was a closure of many specified businesses and venues, and everyone who could work effectively from home were told they should do so. Extra consideration being given for those people at higher risk, and those categories were specified. So during this period of national restrictions, which has gone on pretty well until March the 29th. Obviously, there have been some exceptions, the schools going back on March the 8th, of course. Step one effectively began then. But until that point, you were leaving home really to provide essential services. Where you're unable to work from home, key workers in the essential roles were still attending, going to their workplaces. Things like providing care in other people's homes, that continued as well. The other workplaces that continued during national restrictions, but obviously with rules imposed regarding social distancing, so on and so forth. Clearly, infrastructure, the construction industry and manufacturing, so factories and so on, all had to continue, and they did so, but obviously with the rules in place that were provided. Things like childcare, education, schools have opened, closed, reopened, and as we know, reopened again on March the 8th. Essential public services continued, as did essential retail, supermarkets, chemists, and so on. And at that time, who should go to work? Up till then, currently, you could only leave home for work purposes where unreasonable for you to do your job from home. So that's what we've been living with since January the 6th. It has changed since March the 29th. And as we know, from April the 12th, further changes are going to happen. I'm going to take a very short break in which you can ask questions now, and then I will return with the COVID-19 response, be looking at the government response, the exact way that we're going to navigate the roadmap and how we're going to continue on that road afterwards. So for those of you attending live today, stay on the line. For the purposes of recording, I will now take a break. Welcome back. This is the second part of today's presentation. I'm Steve Bennett, Director of Safety Delivery, and we're now really getting into the teeth of what is happening from now, the government roadmap. This is what they provided, the government response for spring 2021, published in February, and we're all following this now. Here are the dates of the roadmap. I'm sure you're all familiar, but step one, primarily from March the 29th. So we've had that, quickly followed by April the 12th, which is to come. It is confirmed. We're going ahead with that. So as from next Monday. And step three, we're looking just a month or so ahead. Again, this is at the earliest. And finally, step four, June the 21st, at the earliest. These are the dates set out in the roadmap. Whether the dates are adhered to or whether they're extended depends on what the government describes as the four tests. So the vaccine deployment program, it needs to continue successfully. Evidence needs to show that these vaccines are effective. Infection rates mustn't be going up too greatly, no surges, and obviously keeping an eye on other variants, what are called variants of concern. So the four tests are applied before the dates are applied. Now, step one, here we are, 29th of March. So we've had this, the rule of 6 and 2 households out of doors was introduced. There is other sort of soft options. This is after the rather harder option of opening up the schools once again. So there we are, outdoor activities in particular resumed. Working from home continued very much as before. Step two, this is where we see much more of an opening. So the government say rule of 6 is applied or 2 households out of doors. Still no household mixing indoors, of course, and various openings allowed in certain circumstances, but particular we can see that public buildings are reopening, so the libraries, community centres, things like personal care premises, all retail opens up again. So the non-essentials open up alongside the essentials. Outdoor hospitality, again, that is reopening. So some considerable sort of aspects of step two there. And we're going to see how that goes. That'll be very closely monitored before we start thinking about step three and that next date. But there we are, just to underline some of the changes that are occurring, major changes. Let's hope it's the last time that we see such things reopening. We're all really hoping that we now see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, in step two, some key things in the roadmap. We've seen a lot of discussion in media about what it means, but it's a good idea to actually read the thing. It does help because where you see in black and white, you can follow. Now, people should continue to work from home where they can and minimise domestic travel where they can. So that's the official advice in the roadmap at step two. Social distancing and contact rules continue as before. We can see that indoor and outdoor mixing restrictions also continue as before. So a lot is not changing. What we have seen is a lot more of mitigation introduced. The workforce COVID-19 testing, particularly applicable to what are called the risk sectors. So just going back to that, much more testing going on. I'll go into slightly more detail very shortly about the type of testing being done in the workplace and at home. But first, let's just have a look at what happens with step 3. So what do we do? May the 17th, if all goes to plan, then a lot more is going to happen. We can see here that the layout in the government roadmap document. What it means is that all but the most high-risk sectors will open. We're going to have 30 persons limit outdoors. That's a considerable increase. The rule of 6 is remaining to a certain extent 2 households, but this will now be brought in indoors. So again, a significant move there from outdoors to indoors for this rule of 6, and households mixing as well. Indoor entertainment and attractions will be opening up, as will sports and all remaining outdoor entertainment. So step 3 is again a considerable sort of change in terms of what you can do as businesses and as individuals. Domestic hotel overnight accommodation will be opening up. We'll see large events now with capacity limits placed upon them. Indoor events allowed at a 50% capacity or 1,000 persons maximum. Outdoor events, again, the 50% imposition or 4,000 as a maximum, and outdoor seated events as well. We can see that there's a ceiling applied there. But all of this is opening up sectors that have been very badly affected over the past year. We've seen a sort of a closure of some areas that are simply not opened up in all of that time. So again, step 3, another major change. And social distancing and social contact and distancing rules, they will be reviewed and advice will be updated. So the government's keeping an open mind on this one. We see a lot of talk from politicians, much sort of hard questioning from the media as well. But the fact is that if we look at what the roadmap says, options are being left open, and for good reason, because it's so easy to say, yes, we're going to do this, and then you can't do it. Better to leave the options open, review the situation, and then update the advice. And the advice to be updated for step 3 will consider enabling the public to make informed personal decisions. That's the phraseology that's used. And that will involve seeing family and friends, but it will obviously extend to what happens in a business environment as well, and events and that sort of thing. Interestingly, for those of you thinking, right, we're all piling back into the office. Well, in fact, even at step 3, the government will continue to advise the public to work from home where they can. So this is actually the black and white document of the roadmap, something that I will consider further in this presentation. And step 4, this is the bit where perhaps the media will say, hooray, throw your hats in the air, we're all going out and we're going to forget everything. June the 21st is the date. First of all, remember, this is at the earliest. And things that will happen at this point will be, of course, all legal limits on social contact dropped. Remaining closed settings reopen, all large events to resume, but with measures, and they'll be based on the results of the events research program that is going to be introduced. In fact, already has been. We've been told about some of the trials and pilots occurring as part of that. So if you're hoping to go to the FA Cup final, chances are much greater as a result of it being included in a pilot. But no, all of these things are important in terms of determining how much is going to be opened up. And also, we have to bear in mind the 4 tests. Have they all been met? And we may find that as each of these dates come along, it will be harder and harder to meet the 4 tests, at least in full. But then a view will have to be taken on how far they have been met. We can't predict that at the moment. And there will be a full review of social distancing rules. Looking at the document itself, at the roadmap, what does it say? Social distancing. The results of the review will help inform decisions on the timing and circumstances under which rules on the 1 metre plus, face masks and other measures may be lifted. The review being referred to here is one of 4 reviews that will be triggered, the 4 programmes that are going to consider different aspects of how the UK will handle COVID-19 from summer onwards. So these 4 programmes will look at COVID status certification, which I'll come to in a moment, large events. They will look at international travel, and the 4th one is social distancing, which I'll refer to in this slide. This review covering social distancing will inform guidance on working from home as well. So the working from home still remains as advice up to the point of the review of social distancing. So that's a very interesting point there, I think, because many people may believe that you have to go back to the office from a certain date, but in fact you have to consider how you're going to do that and bear in mind the government advice. It's all there in the document. We can see a little layout there of steps 1 and 2. There we are, steps 3 and 4. And also advice on what are safe behaviours. This will be important because this will be part of the review. What happens after June the 21st? Will we be observing all of these same safe behaviours? Will we be wearing our masks still? Will we be maintaining the 2 metres, the 1 metre plus, or just trying everything to abandonment? I think it will be an important part of the programmes for reviewing. Testing, now we're well aware of all the testing regime really being ramped up, particularly for individuals just in this past week. That is in the roadmap. So we can see here how schools and colleges, businesses, NHS, community testing. So they're all covered. Workplace testing, the twice weekly testing. This is covered. So the rapid lateral flow tests, we've seen that workplace testing is going to be underway, but you needed to register by April the 12th for that. Many hundreds of thousands of workplaces have done so. Employees now, incidentally, the workplace tests, they are in place, but employees only need to take those really where they cannot work from home. So what do you do where employees are still working from home, or there may be a mix where they may be coming in? Now, there is obviously a new regime on individual tests. All COVID-19 safety measures remain in place, by the way. That's irrespective of test results or whether you've had vaccinations. So nothing changes in terms of your safety measures. And individual tests, of course, are now becoming available. And you should assist the test and trace system by keeping temporary record of shift staff patterns for 21 days. So there is this obligation to assist NHS test and trace, particularly where they request data. How would you tie the two together? What you may consider is that an employee, as an individual, has the right to have these tests done, but these individual tests tie in with NHS test and trace. So an individual does need to report results to NHS test and trace, and this is where you can tie the two together with the employer, because if everyone is feeding into the NHS test and trace, you will not have such issues about confidentiality. You're worried about the data protection, this kind of thing. Perhaps this is the way that we can combine the two without too much infringement, because NHS test and trace will enable everyone to notify each other of positive tests. Different types of guidance. Now, under COVID, I'm hoping that employers, organisations are very familiar with this, because the guides provided by the government really are the staple of our information, and the websites themselves not only provide all the up-to-date information, but they do provide links to further guides where you need specialist information. They're frequently updated. It's very important to monitor them and review them so that you understand how they affect your own industry, your own environment, and your own circumstances. And the roadmap, the progress of the roadmap will be reflected in the guidance itself. Hopefully people are familiar with this site. This is the government website. So you would go through to this, first of all, working safely during coronavirus, COVID-19. And then that will provide all these links. So if you have Office, then you'll go to the Office contact centres advice, you'll click through to that. This will give you great detail about what you should and shouldn't be doing, and it is updated on a very regular basis. Shops and branches, construction, other outdoor work. So we can see that all of these sort of links are there. Restaurant, pubs, bars, takeaway services, working in other people's homes. And there we are, the 14. So they're all there. Click through to whatever applies to you. If there's nothing specific, we'll come to that in a very short while. But clearly, we're looking at who should go to work. So who should go to work? Things are changing all the time. But at the moment, let's look at office workers, for example. It's still the case that office workers should work from home if they can. Employers should ensure workplaces are safe for anyone who cannot work from home. So there's clear advice there. Anyone else who cannot work from home should go to their place of work. So we are seeing this return to work now, obviously, with the roadmap, with the dates coming along, changes occurring. But it's still the case that employers should consult with their workers to determine who needs to come into the workplace. It's important as well. The employers are engaging with workers through existing communication routes. Remember, I mentioned in the first part of this presentation about the importance of communications, and that is all part of existing legislation. But there are other sort of mechanical means as well. Worker representatives, if you have trade unions, but even if you don't have trade unions, you're still obliged to work through any type of representation, albeit group or through individuals, to explain and agree the changes that are taking place in working arrangements. Who should go to work? We talked about the people in the higher risk categories, so extra consideration needs to be given for those people. So you'll need to reflect this in your COVID-19 workplace risk assessment. Very key here. So when you are considering people at higher risk coming back or going into potentially hazardous environments, you need to consider your risk assessment. Specifically, there are sections in the government guidance. Here we can see protecting people who are at higher risk. So you can see a lot of up-to-date detail on the government website. Objective here is to support those who are at a higher risk of infection and or an adverse outcome if infected. So what does that mean? Well, higher risk groups, they are identified now, covering things such as age, BMI, BAME community, and health conditions such as diabetes. So protective measures for these clinically extremely vulnerable individuals need to be considered, put in place. If you remember, we were talking about the risk assessments and putting in place controls as part of your risk assessment process. So here we are, controls in place, because there are duties for protecting those with what are called the protected characteristics. So that's people with disabilities, but people who come into all these other categories as well, and that covers things like race, sex, gender, and so on. So there is an obligation. Many will be aware of the Equality Act 2010 as well, which ties in with all of this, that it needs to be part of risk assessing, and as also support for mental health. Important aspect now going on, that is in place. So you might need to consider that as part of controls as well. What support for mental health going forward? So we need to consider all the high risk factors in our COVID-19 risk assessment. Personal risk assessments, we need to consider this, covering factors and other issues that may be raised as part of a meaningful consultation on returning to the workplace, work environment. So if we are bringing people back, we need to engage with them, have meaningful consultation, and a personal risk assessment is the best way of doing that, because you are not just engaging people, but you're showing yourself to engage with people, and you're demonstrating that as part of risk assessment. I've talked about the importance of demonstration. This is a good example. Vaccination status. Yes, now the idea of what are called so-called vaccine passports, well, is highly contentious. But when we talk about personal risk assessments, remember this is a confidential matter as well between you and your employee. So it's a very good forum indeed for having discussions about concerns, because everyone feels comfortable, they're covered by this confidentiality. And you can at this point consider vaccination status without sort of going too far beyond the boundaries of data protection. You can discuss, have you had a vaccination? If the employee is willing to discuss that, then of course you can go from there, and you can consider the fact that that individual may have had a vaccination, first one, second one, but it's all part of the risk assessment process, and the personal risk assessment, confidential part of the process. So you're not going beyond any bounds, and you can make sort of judgments that are well considered, and it's all part of the vital consultation that you have with employees about returning to work environments. And we can find special guidance beyond all of the government links that I've discussed and shown you so far. They can take you through further for guidance on things like schools, further education, childcare, the public transport, all of those aspects. Guidance for other things, the multi-purpose community facilities. I'm sure some will be aware of this type of further link. So it's not just the 14, the big 14 guidance links, but they can take you through to various other areas where it will break down and give you more detail in some of those areas in which you're involved. So business and organisations, we're looking at action now. What action should you be taking? We have the roadmap. We have all of this government guidance that's being issued. Well, clearly, we need to be following that as it's given. So you keep a very close eye on the guidance and ensure that you are following the law. A lot of the law has been there for a long time. So we need to follow that. And the law as it sort of changes under government guidance as well. So key is follow the guidance. And then we look at your health and safety policies, your procedures, your risk assessments. Now, am I talking about COVID there? No, in fact, we should have these things in place. We should have our health and safety policies. We should have our procedures, and we should have our risk assessments by law. All of the health and safety legislation is there that says we must have it. So what we will be doing is in future developing those safety procedures and those risk assessments that we've carried out for COVID-19. And we're going to sort of incorporate them into our health and safety policies, procedures, and our risk assessments that as good employers, I'm sure we've already got in place, and they're all working very well and everyone is aware of them. But that's what we will be doing in future. And of course, all relevant information, as always, must be exchanged, not just with your employees, but all others. As we've seen, there is that duty, that obligation under all existing legislation. So, for example, a business or an organisation, you can see here, you should have a health and safety policy in place. It may look a little bit like that. Similarly, health and safety procedures, you might have general procedures, a little bit like that, and your procedures might break down into more detail. In fact, I'm sure they will. Particular aspects of your general procedures that do apply to your own type of business, your own type of organisation, the activities that you undertake. So a health and safety risk assessment, a general one, will be considering all of these things: machinery, plant, power, workstations, working at your computers, environment, health, heating and air conditioning, ventilation, comfort, welfare. Now, we should already be covering these things, I have to stress, but of course, a lot of the new guidance is going into greater detail. Those of you who are really keeping up to date with the government website updates will have noticed that very recently air conditioning, ventilation has been added in a more copious quantity. The special sections now devoted to ventilation just in recent days. So that is probably thinking forward to opening of more internal environments. So where we are getting businesses opening up, people going inside more, into cafes, into shops, shops, into so many more environments, and of course, ultimately back into offices. It's been recognised ventilation, which was there in guidance, is now being considered as important enough to have its own category, and they're very keen now to ensure that all inside environments really do meet higher standards in terms of COVID-19 safety. Disease, stress, accidents and incidents, again, things that should be in your risk assessments ordinarily, but again will incorporate now the COVID-19 risks. But we might be thinking about this a bit more in future. Disease, might not have considered that very much before, but do we want, for example, presenteeism in future? Is obviously a very hot thing now, hot subject, that anyone with symptoms for COVID must stay away. Keep away, don't come near. But really, should we be thinking about this in terms of flu? If you have people with flu coming in because they feel that they must come in, otherwise they're under pressure, will they be sort of sacked for not coming in and missing days at work? Is that a good idea when we're spreading disease? Should we think about this more in our policies and procedures? Especially now that more people are working from home, and there could be a mix in future, people working from home and in the workplace. So we will be considering a bit more flexibility there. Handling of substances, all sorts of things, slips and trips, again, part of your general health and safety at work risk assessment. All of your working systems and your security, training of staff, all of that in a general health and safety risk assessment for your business or your organisation. And that's just a front page example of what you might have. I have mentioned that the health and safety executive do have great advice on setting up risk assessments. Obviously, as a business, as a consultant myself, I provide this as a specialist service. And this is the type of thing that you might see. Safety procedures, obviously government guidance must be implemented, and you will be referring to the relevant and specific guidance here in terms of drawing up, developing your safety procedures, and you'll be detailing the working methods and your risk controls, and monitoring and reviewing very regularly so that you're updating and keeping safe on a daily basis. These detailed measures, you'll be obviously considering the management of workers and volunteers as well. This is all covered in the Health and Safety at Work Act, by the way. The workers obviously are at the forefront, but for those of you who have a large volunteer basis, or any volunteers at all, they're covered in a separate part of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Clients, customers, the general public, again, that's covered under Health and Safety at Work Act, but you'll have detailed measures where you're in contact with clients, customers, general public, and you'll have your policies and procedures on social distancing and face covering, cleaning, the mitigation of risks, all of this, keeping a close eye on those government guidance websites. You might have something like this in terms of your safety procedures. So you'll have a lot of procedures perhaps, and you may have them documented in this type of way. And the health and safety risk assessment itself, then you'll consider things like vulnerable persons, that personal contact, the numbers of staff and volunteers that you have, number of clients, visitors, general public, how many, in what space, and obviously the layout and security, important aspects. You'll be looking at the surfaces, whether they're fixed or whether it's equipment that's being used, Fixed surfaces, I mean by walls, glass, that type of thing. Environment, ventilation, the temperature, the welfare facilities that you provide. If you're handling food, goods, materials, again, that will be in your risk assessment, because we're looking at these as hazards. Remember, the risk assessment aspect that I looked at in the first part of this presentation. So what are the hazards? What are the risks? What are the controls? And then you'll be looking at the specific tasks being undertaken. A lot of this will be outlined in the procedures that you've done in your preceding document. So you'll be looking at actions and events. You must also consider the travel that is between home and sites where people are going to undertake their work. The stress and the mental health. May consider doing a specific stress and mental health risk assessment. Certainly in terms of COVID-19, what is the impact? You'll be needing to consider that. And your communications, how are you communicating with staff and volunteers? How are you exchanging information? You need to do so. And what is the contingency plan if you do get outbreaks? If you get a virus infection, of course, you need to have that contingency in place. What plans do you have? And that will be covered in the risk assessment as well. So an example of what your health and safety risk assessment associated specifically with COVID-19 might look like. I would, everyone has a different way of going about things in terms of separating procedures from risk assessment. I always advise, have your procedures as I've outlined, because they're a movable feast, aren't they? You change that as you go along as needs be, as advice changes, and that can be on a very regular basis. Whereas if you have a risk assessment, you've already identified your hazards and your risks in the main. So therefore, what changes is clearly the controls, but you've got your template for your risk assessment. You're not constantly changing that particular document. The movable document, as it should be, are your procedures. Okay, so that's just some advice. You may get different advice from others. That's absolutely fine. But this is the approach that I take. I've mentioned the importance of personal risk assessments. And clearly, if we go ahead with COVID-19 personal risk assessments, we'll be looking at things like the role of that person, their personal vulnerabilities, whether they have protected characteristics, any other vulnerabilities in their households, whether they have symptoms or they've had COVID, any diagnosis. And you would incorporate not the personal details, because it is a personal interview with someone, so you retain that confidentiality. But if you get results that are important, that would feed into the full COVID risk assessment, then you would do that. And obviously in personal risk assessments, again, the travel welfare, that person, are they traveling a long way? How are they traveling? What stress issues do they have? Are they comfortable returning to a workplace? Important to ask that question. Do you need to make reasonable adjustments for them? And obviously, you must consider all latest guidance and new risk alert levels. So your personal risk assessment, COVID risk assessment, may look something like this. I'm coming to the end of the presentation now, but obviously a big thing that's occurred just very recently is what about these passports? What does it all mean? And many politicians will tell you many different things. As an advisor, I can only direct you to what's in black and white, and indeed the government roadmap itself. So here we are. It says it, doesn't it, in this particular section that I've copied here. So what they call the status certification could play a role in reopening the economy, and it can reduce restrictions on social contact and improving safety, etc. So here we are. What will it mean? The government does say, to be fair to it, despite what all debate is going on at the moment, that it is something that is under consideration. So the government will consider the ethical, equalities, privacy, legal, operational aspects, etc. And it will draw on external advice to develop recommendations. So all of that is still to come, because it's stated here that the conclusions will be set out in advance of step 4 in order to inform the safe reopening of society and the economy. That's why we're having this debate at the moment. There's a lot of talk, obviously at present, about the individual rights, but one hopes that this is being taken into account because it is part of the set out roadmap. So there are independent links as well. I've mentioned the HSE, they're one of those. Clearly, you must keep your eye on the government websites for all of the latest advice, but people like IOSH, I am a member of IOSH, a trainer for them, Institution of Safety, Occupational Safety and Health. So their website is updated, returning safely. HSE itself, of course, you can see the link there. 2 links, in fact, because I've mentioned risk assessments. You can go to their advice on COVID risk assessments, amongst many other things on their website. And the NHS, of course, you can get direct advice from the NHS. Your way forward, that's what this has been about today. I hope I've given you a good idea of the way through the roadmap, but much more importantly, I believe, is the way forward beyond the roadmap. And I've looked at that in greater detail today. So that's what we should be looking at, and I hope you'll be looking at over the coming weeks and the months, and considering all of the lessons and actions that need to be taken now, in the near future, the short term and the longer term future. Thank you, everybody, for listening. For those who are watching the recording, thank you very much indeed. I hope it's been helpful. You can see my contact details there. Please do feel free to give me a call, give me an email. If you want to ask any questions, if you have any feedback, I do look forward to hearing from you. I'm now going to conclude the recording part of this presentation, and I will be going to the attendees for their questions. So thank you very much indeed, and I will now be signing out of the recording aspect.